We're good. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Janelle Orsi from Sustainable Economies Law Center, also part of the Next Egg team. The Next Egg is a collaborative project of 3 groups: Lift Economy, Sustainable Economies Law Center, and Michael Schuman. TheNextEgg.org is where a lot of the action is happening. It's a website that is both a social network and a sort of a library of resources that we're building up. We organize webinars approximately once a month. So I encourage people to go on that site and join it if you haven't already. If the $9.99 per month is a squeeze, just send me an email and I'm happy to send you a link to join for free. The money is just helping us cover our costs. And I will also post in the chat in a couple minutes a link where you can join and get the first month free. So, and just to give you an idea about other things that the Next Egg is doing, we're not just an online resource and community, we're also actively organizing people and getting them access to tools so they can start self-directing their retirement savings. One of our first projects is called the First Hatch, where we're getting 100 people, self-employed people, to start solo 401ks, which actually give you checkbook control over your retirement savings. So we have 20 people all set up. We have another 20 people in the works, and we're going to be trying to get up to 100 early this year. But we're going to have future quote unquote hatches, because everything has to be an egg pun. But early this year, we're going to be focusing on getting workplaces set up to start employee directed plans, and then hopefully later this year, looking more closely at options for self-directed IRAs. So that's just a little bit about the Next Egg project. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Michael Schuman, who will introduce himself and the rest of the speakers, Janice Shade and Brian Beck.
Okay.
Okay. You should be able to press your share button now. And Brian's here.
Share button. There we go. Okay. Go to the beginning. So thank you all for attending. And I am Michael Schuman. I've, among other things, besides involvement in the Next Egg, I'm just finishing a book called Put Your Money Where Your Life Is, which is on how to use self-directed IRAs and solo 401ks for local investing. And one of the places that I think more and more of us are looking for putting our resources into our community is local investment funds. And over the last 6 months, I and my co-authors have been putting together this handbook on community investment funds with the subtitle, A How-To Guide for Building Local Wealth, Equity, and Justice. And roughly for the next 45 minutes, we're going to split up the contents of the Community Investment Fund Handbook and just give you a taste of what's inside it. We won't obviously be able to get into the fine details, but by the time we are done with this, in the chat section or somewhere else, we're going to upload a link where you can download the handbook. I will mention that I'm going to talk for about 10-15 minutes and then hand it over to Janice Shade and then to Brian Beckton. And I will give them a formal introduction in just a second. But first, I want to mention that this handbook is really the product of 2 organizations that you should know about. One is the Solidago Foundation, and that's a picture of Jeff Rosen, the COO of Solidago, who has for 10 years or more been really interested in trying to figure out how to creatively jumpstart local investment. And we're gonna talk later about a fund called PV Grows, or Pioneer Valley Grows, and this has been one of the projects that Solidago Foundation has spearheaded. And the other organization is the National Coalition for Community Capital, which is about 3 years old. And it's a network of movers and shakers in the local investment field who are really trying to share how to educate the public about this, what needs to change in policy, what are some of the innovations, and particularly at the state and local level. So I encourage you to check out both these organizations if you're interested in this field. The handbook itself was a collaboration among four of us, and three of the four of us will present today. The fourth person on the upper right-hand corner is Amy Cortez. She will not be presenting. She is the author of a book you should all read called Locavesting. In the lower left-hand corner is a woman named Janice Shade, who herself has written a book that's going to come out fairly soon about women in investing. She has her own organization focusing on local investment in and around New England. And for a number of years, she ran a portal to help facilitate local investing in Vermont called Milk Money. And then on the lower right-hand side is Brian Becken. And Brian Becken is a senior attorney with Cutting Edge Capital based in Oakland. And they are really one of the go-to law firms to understand the legality of anything around local investment. A word about the origins of this project. In 2013, I'm stuck in World War I. In 2013, 2014, Jeff Rosen approached me and Jenny Casson. Then both of us were working for Cutting Edge Capital to try to come up with a handbook on creating a community investment fund, but really to focus on the nuts and bolts of what was needed to be done for the emerging PV Grows Fund in New England. And this is still available online for downloading. And some of the themes in this handbook are in the new handbook. But what we noticed over the last 5-6 years was that there was an enormous number of new, innovative, interesting kinds of funds that had been created. And we wanted to do an updated version of this handbook that took into account all these new innovations. And by the time we were done with this discussion, we realized we just needed to start from scratch. So the handbook that we're releasing today has 4 real parts to it. And one part is talking about the importance of local investing. Now, 99% of the people who are here on this call already understand these arguments, so we're not going to go through them today. But for others who might pick this up for starters, that's really important. The second part of the handbook is kind of it's a series of 10 case studies that more or less describe in 2 or 3 pages each what the innovations in each of these case studies is, and then citations if you want to go deeper and learn more about these case studies. Then there is another section which is how to create your own community investment fund, and Janice will be talking about that after I speak. And then finally, we do a deep dive on the law and exemptions in the Investment Company Act in 1940, and Brian will be discussing those. I think one good question to start with is, why are funds so important in the local investment field? And I think there's at least 4 reasons why we think funds deserve special attention. The first is that what we're noticing about crowdfunding is that when people go out and have to find and evaluate every local investment one at a time, it's a lot of work. It's exhausting. And what most of us do in our investments in the Wall Street world is we rely on fund managers to do all of this work for us. It's not only a question of selection and getting that work off your lap, but also trying to work with the companies that are involved in a fund and help them succeed, because most funds are not totally passive with respect to the companies or other projects they're involved in. They work with them. They're trying to make them succeed. So the probability of a company going under once it's in a fund is going to be lower than if it has no such support system. The third advantage to a fund is diversification of risk. And obviously, when you put money into one company, especially if it's a startup, there's some good chance that that company could fail and you lose everything. But if you have multiple companies in a pool, the chance of all of them failing is significantly lower. And the last issue is liquidity. People have a desire to be able to pull their money in and out of their investments. In a lot of local investments that people are finding in crowdfunding, if it's a loan, yes, it's for a limited term of years and it is somewhat liquid, but if it's local stock, there's not necessarily a clear place where you can go out and sell that stock. And so this is not particularly liquid. Now, there are a bunch of funds out there already. And some of these funds are designed for accredited investors and some for grassroots investors. And to remind you, an accredited investor is basically someone in the top 5% or higher of income or wealth in the United States. And accredited investors can find hedge funds, venture funds, economic development funds, most of the CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution funds. Those are only open to accredited investors. Most of the Opportunity Zone funds that have been established as a consequence of the 2017 tax reform, most of those are only open to accredited investors. And while some of these funds do have growing portfolios of securities that are social impact businesses or social impact projects, very few of these funds carry any form of local investment. That is connecting investors in a place with a business or a project in a place. In the grassroots funds category, there are clearly about 9,000 funds out there: mutual funds, pension funds, insurance funds, exchange traded funds. These are made for mass markets. They're expensive to set up, and they too are almost entirely about Wall Street traded securities. Now, the only exception is that you can find municipal bonds, and in a few funds, they may be slightly geographically focused, and maybe you can do a tiny bit of local investment through municipal bonds in these funds. And these funds also have some social impact alternatives, but again, it's not a local impact. We see a bunch of benefits to creating funds that are dedicated to a particular community or a city or a region or a state. It becomes possible to think about putting money into these funds and supporting local businesses, which is the best way of stimulating local economic development. It's also possible to think about putting money into projects that are oriented around specific problems. So, for example, if you're creating a big solar project to become energy independent, you might be able to put your money into that. Or if you're talking about affordable housing, you might be able to put your money into that. The last thing we see is really significant about community investment funds is they allow an approach to social impact that the current social impact funds really aren't. And that is, they allow us to get to distressed communities and to individuals, people of color, women, people who the conventional funding universe are almost entirely overlooking. And some of the best models that we'll talk about today really cover this corner of the universe. From our standpoint, a community investment fund should have 4 characteristics. The first is that grassroots investors in the community should be able to participate in the fund. And this is legally challenging, but not impossible. The second characteristic is that the fund should be investing, if not exclusively, mostly in the defined local community. The third characteristic, and this is rare, but again, you can find some examples of this, that there is local decision making. And that is that if you're focused on, say, certain African American communities in your city with the fund, you want members of those communities sitting on the fund, making decisions alongside everyone else on where the money goes and what the terms and conditions are. The last key characteristic is that you want the fund to be delivering a rate of return. And we do want to draw a distinction between the good work that philanthropy can do in many communities, but there is no rate of return when you participate in that, and an investment rate of return, which can be in many forms. It can be interest on a loan, it can be dividend or appreciation on stock, it can be royalty in some kind of royalty agreement, a profit sharing agreement. Now, we covered in our handbook 10 case studies, and this is a summary of the case studies. And I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but what you can see is it covers a broad set of locations: Boston, Denver, Oakland, Missoula, Vermont, generally in Illinois, and a variety of topics, a variety of focal points. So most of these funds don't cover the earth. They actually defined a neck of economic or other forms of development that they're focused on. Some are focused on racial equity, some on housing, some on legacy businesses, some on food systems, some on general regional vitality as defined by health. And there are a variety of exemptions in the Investment Company Act that these funds rely on. And Brian will go over these in more detail, but I just, point out some of them here. And I want to give 5 examples of the kinds of funds we cover in a little more detail, just to give you a flavor of what they look like. So one example is the Boston Impact Initiative, started by Deborah Fries on the far right. It was founded in 2017, and it is focused almost entirely on racial equity. And its target is to generate $10 million. And one of the interesting things about the structure of this is that it has defined different tiers of involvement, different tiers of investment based on the income of the participants. So for grassroots investors are community notes, and you have to buy a note for 3 years and you get 3% on it. But they do something very interesting, which is they take money from philanthropic entities, and that's the philanthropic notes, which have to put in money for 5 years as really a recoverable grant. It's not so much an investment. And that money is used as a way of guaranteeing the payment on the community notes and the middle tier, the solidarity notes, so that if a bunch of businesses go belly up, it turns out that the first level of loss is absorbed by the philanthropy, and that makes it easier. More confidence is inspired in the grassroots investors to participate in the fund. And they've had a lot of success with this, and Deborah is now leading a cohort of 12 other communities around the United States to implement this kind of model. The second example is GoodWorks Evergreen in Montana, founded in 2019. And they've had another fund, which is called GoodWorks Ventures. They've been investing in 35 businesses, and it's primarily been accredited investors that have put the money in, but they decided they wanted to do something a little bit different with a new fund. And this new fund actually acquires businesses with the idea of freshening them up and redeploying them. And specifically what they're interested in is, you know, across the United States, there are locally owned businesses that are going to be losing their owners soon. The founders are aging out, their kids don't want to take over the business. How can we save these sort of vital institutions on Main Street? And so their first acquisition was Don's Home Center, which got them involved in the hardware business. And they're seeing themselves as getting involved in a bunch of different companies this way. Example number 3, which was started in part by Janelle Orsi, who started us off today, is the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Co-op, founded in 2017. And their focus is promoting affordable housing in Oakland. They were inspired by some of the models that you can find in community land trusts, but community land trusts are nonprofits, and there's not a lot of room for outside investors. So they quite creatively thought about how to bring in more outside capital and sort of bring the affordable housing businesses to scale in a co-op. So they teamed up with an organization called People of Color Housing Network. They have 12 current projects, real estate projects, that they are looking closely at. And their members are typically putting $1,000 in and can expect a 1.5% dividend. And when I asked Janelle earlier today, I said, what is the target you're really looking at? She said, you know, a couple of $2 billion, which I think is a fair target when you're thinking about affordable housing in the US. Example number 4 is the Northeast Kingdom Prosperity Fund. This is in rural Vermont in 3 counties in the northeastern corner of the state, Essex, Orleans, and Caledonia. This was founded in 2009, and the focus is broadly regional prosperity, but it has an interesting origin. It was founded in part after work done under a Robert Wood Johnson grant focused on public health. And they decided, you know, getting some capital into the region to focus on 5 areas would be very important for regional vitality. Those areas are housing, healthy food, financial security, and mental health and physical health. And the picture you're looking at here is Laurel Ruggles. She is one of the key implementers of this now. Let me go back for a second. One thing I wanted to say about this example is that it's a pooled income fund. So basically, people are donating money in the short term. They're putting money into a trust. That money pays income to the people over their lifetime. And when the investors die, that principal, that corpus, goes into the Northeast Kingdom. And it's a very interesting structure for a local investment fund. And then number 5 is kind of for us, in a way, the granddaddy, one of the granddaddies of this, Pioneer Valley Grows, founded in 2015, focused on food systems. They've raised about $2 million thus far. Their target is to go to a little bit more than that. They currently have 70 investors, most of whom are accredited, but they would like to have unaccredited investors in the business, in this as well. They currently have 35 businesses that they're covering. And one of the businesses that I think is terrific is, I'm going to mispronounce it, but Mysoterra Farms, which grows mushrooms and has been a successful new local food business gaining capital. So I am now going to pause and turn this over to Janice, but I will say that we're going to have ample time after I present, Janice presents, and Brian presents for questions. So please put your questions in the chat and we'll pick them up, or just stick around. So hang on and let me pass this over to Janice.
All right. All right, I think I will just start. I'll say hello, and I'm going to go straight into sharing my screen. I am the founder of the Initiative for Local Capital, which is all about exploring and researching new techniques, new methods for local investment and community-based capital. What I bring to this presentation today is kind of the practical how-tos of how to actually get started with this. And you know, I kind of chuckled when Michael said that that I'd have 15 minutes to present this, because I think in the handbook it's contained in 15 pages. So to try to condense that down to 15 minutes will be challenging. But what I'm going to try to do is just give you some of the key things to really be thinking about as you are considering taking steps towards creating a community investment fund. And I will say I have worked so far with a couple organizations and communities on setting up community investment funds. So I've gotten a pretty deep dive in how this all takes place, and happy to answer questions at the end about that particular stuff. So without further ado, the first place that you have to start is with your team, because without people, this isn't going to happen. Creating a community investment fund is a long-term endeavor, and one that will take some time and effort and require resources and expertise from a variety of different perspectives and disciplines to help make it really happen. So the first place that you got to start is building out that team. Now, ideally, you will have some kind of an anchor institution, perhaps as the whether it's the organizer or just even the place where you can always have your meetings. It's important, helpful to have some kind of an organization that has the deep roots in the community. Often we've seen these CDFIs or other nonprofits, but like as in the case with the Northeast Kingdom Prosperity Fund, the anchor organization there was a hospital. It could even be a for-profit business, but just having an organization where you'll have kind of the institutional backing to house your team and to provide the longevity over time is a big help. The other key piece you will need is a project champion. And this is, here I'm talking about a person. And whether that person comes from is an employee or a member of the anchor institution or not, doesn't really matter. It might be helpful, but doesn't really matter. But really just having that one person who is kind of the anchor in human form of making sure that things are getting done, meetings are set up, information is communicated, and and just really kind of being the one to wrangle all the rest of the folks in your group. Other key aspects of perspectives that you want to have represented on your team, having someone who can come from the community outreach perspective, or have a marketing background and can do help create marketing materials. You might be creating a website. You're definitely going to have many opportunities to interact with your community. So having that type of expertise is really key. The other key piece is having the finance and accounting perspective. We're talking about a fund here, and we're talking about money and numbers and spreadsheets. So having someone who is facile with numbers and spreadsheets, and especially from the financial perspective, will be pretty important as you get into the nitty-gritty of setting up your fund. And then there's the actual logistics and the operations. You know, how does this fund actually work? And really getting into the details of figuring out the flow of money into the fund, what happens when the investment is made out, what kind of interaction you're going to have with your portfolio companies, and thinking through all of those details, whether you're going to be providing technical assistance to any of your portfolio companies. Having that perspective from the operational standpoint will be incredibly helpful. And then, of course, just having an advisory capacity is very helpful. I've seen something very useful on a couple teams that I've worked with that have kind of a community member at large who just is there to represent the voice of the community and the perspective of the community, and can be a sounding board for ideas. So this is the key piece, and we even say in the handbook, before you read any further into any of the other steps, you should have your team assembled, so that as you start working through the other steps of setting up your community investment fund, you have your team on board and engaged from the very beginning. So once you have that, the next key piece is to set the objectives of your fund. We recommend starting with a theory of change, which is, if you're not familiar with this, it's similar to a mission or vision, but it goes a little bit deeper in that it actually talks about how your actions will help you achieve your long-term goals. For instance, a theory of change for a community investment fund that I worked with, they built right into their theory of change their desire to include grassroots unaccredited investors as a way to try to propel community wealth and to bring more equity to their community wealth. So by stating we want to include unaccredited investors, they're stating how their actions will help them achieve those long-term goals. The next big thing is the geographic focus. And this is going to be really different depending on every different situation. It can vary as widely as, Michael talked about the Northeast Kingdom Fund covered 3 communities or 3 counties in one state, a pretty broad geographic region. But when you realize that there are only 65,000 residents in the total in those 3 counties, it seemed appropriate to have that broad of a reach. Whereas, we've seen other funds getting started in neighborhoods within a large urban setting in the Midwest, where it's, not even the full city, but just a neighborhood. So it really is going to depend on population density and how you define community and how broadly you wish to cast your net. So there is, a bit of some guardrails that you can put on as you're thinking about how broadly you want to set up your geographic focus. On the one hand, you want to make sure that you're choosing a region or an area that's big enough to have enough deal flow. And by that, I mean enough investable opportunities. Are there enough current and potential businesses for your fund to invest in? As well as your investor base. If you're planning to draw your investors from your community, you want to make sure that you have a broad enough region defined to make sure that you meet those goals. Another thing to be aware of also is looking at you could call it the competitive environment if you wanted to, in terms of other sources of capital. Very often there are other existing sources of capital. Theoretically, though, if you're feeling the need to set up a community investment fund, you've obviously identified some gaps that those current sources are not filling, but being aware of what those other sources are, what overlap there might be, and even perhaps reaching out to some of them and initiating some conversations about how there could be potential for collaboration between different sources of capital in terms of creating deals. So just becoming aware of what other sources of capital are out there within your geographic region will be important. Then once you have that, then you really kind of start to get down to the really nitty-gritty part of what is your fund meant to do with your economic mission. What are the gaps that you're trying to fill? What are the problems that you're trying to solve, whether that is trying to bring more funding to local farmers to enhance the food shed viability, or to focus on creating more equitable access to capital for people of color within a certain region. Starting to define specifically what it is that you are setting out to do will be an important part, because this is all going to be useful as you then start to figure out who you're going to invest in and what kind of investors you want to attract. Then we get down to the business model. And there's a lot of work that needs to go on here. And I've tried to boil it down to 4 bullet points, but there's a lot that goes on underneath all of them. And so I'm going to touch on them at the highest level, but just putting the caveat out there that there's a lot of thinking and discussion that needs to go on here. And this is the place where, if you haven't already with your team, this might be the point in your development where you might want to engage legal and or financial advisory help, bringing in some consultants to help you think through all of this. Certainly from a legal perspective, to help you understand what types of legal models might fit best with what you're trying to achieve. And Brian's going to talk a lot more about that in a minute, so you'll see what I mean there. But then also from the financial standpoint, engaging someone, if you don't have the expertise on your team, engaging someone who can help you with the financial modeling. And this is a tricky one, and I kind of know from personal experience, finding financial consultants who understand the goals and the vision for community investment funds. There aren't a whole lot of us out there, but hopefully the more community investment funds we have springing up around the country, the more we'll be able to bring more financial consulting services online to help out with this. But don't despair. There's more than just me out there, but I'm out there too to help. So the things that you want to be thinking about as you're building your business model is, once you've defined your geographic region and you start to get an idea of how many businesses you might be able to support and how many investors you might be able to attract, it's time to start putting numbers on paper and building out a model for just how much you can expect to raise from your community. Some community, we've seen funds range anywhere from $2 million up to $10 million, and maybe even a little bit more. So, if you are, one neighborhood in a big urban center, it might be easier to raise $10 million than a rural county that has less dense population. So really starting to think about and doing some real gut checking on how much you think you can actually raise. And this is where your advisory board could be helpful in being a sounding board here. Then once you settle on a number, that's when you can really start to think about, is this enough to really achieve what we're trying to set out to do with our theory of change? Again, building out the financial models that help you to think through, if we have $2 million and we're making 200 investments of $50,000 each over this period of time, is that enough to really move the needle on what we're trying to do? So these are the kinds of things that you'll want to be modeling out in your financial spreadsheets. And again, are there enough investment opportunities? I think I already touched on that one enough. And then the big one here is does your team have what it takes to be able to manage all of this? Because when you start talking about tens of millions or even just millions of dollars, there are very real compliance issues that come along with this, as well as expectations of your community on the fiscal responsibilities of your fund. And so thinking through what it will take to actually manage and run a fund, which takes me into the next piece of this, the operational structure. What we've done in the handbook is put together a checklist that goes much deeper than these bullet points, but kind of give you the top level ideas of the areas where you will need to have just focus and certain types of expertise. Starting with who will manage the fund. If your anchor institution is an existing CDFI or nonprofit that perhaps is already running a charitable loan fund, that's in many ways an ideal situation. They already have the expertise on board for how to receive funds into, or how to receive investments into the fund, and then how to account for them, how to report out on them, and how to deploy investments. So, if you have that, great. If you don't, that's something that you'll want to think about. Now, some types of funds, and you'll see this when Brian talks, depending on your legal structure, some forms of funds are required that they are managed by the members, meaning that every investor must have a say and a part in managing the fund. So that's something to think through as you are setting up your legal structure about whether that activity is going to be feasible or not. And then you might decide that maybe this is all too difficult and we'll hire a professional manager. Then you need to think about the costs involved with that and how you'll get those things paid for. Investor participation, if you are going to include the grassroots unaccredited investors, it adds a layer of complexity, but it doesn't, it's not complex enough to preclude, to not include them, I should say, because there are just far too many benefits, we believe, to actually include them. But it's just something that you need to be aware of as you're going forward. Then thinking through, what's the lifetime of this fund? Is it one that you will expect investments to generate a return on investment, some of which can be returned out to investors, and maybe some of it will stay within the fund and be reinvested into new investment opportunities over time? Or will it have a finite life and maybe you do this over 5 years or so many companies, and then that's the end? So figuring out how you want to do that. And then finally, the compliance piece. And I'm going to let Brian talk a little bit more about the compliance from a legal standpoint in setting up the fund, but then there will be ongoing compliance requirements, filing both with the IRS, the SEC, and just being aware of those and planning for them. And so, but I'll just give real top level on the legal structure. Some of the key things that you'll want to think through, as we've mentioned, including unaccredited investors does bring a layer of complexity. Your business focus, if you are focusing kind of broadly on any kind of business, or if you say want to specialize in real estate, can have an impact on your legal structure. And then most notably is how you want to make investments out into the community. If you want to do that just as debt through notes, there are structures that allow for that. If you want to make equity-like investments, which often can be desirable, that's often a gap in many communities and their financial markets not having the availability for equity-like investments that sometimes are more appropriate for early stage businesses. Only certain types of community investment fund legal structures allow for equity type investments. So keeping all of these things in mind. And so hopefully what I'm doing is trying to set up Brian to take you through all this. And I will say at the end, I've kind of thrown a lot at you. And like I said, it's 15 pages of the handbook. So there's a lot to do with all this, but don't do it alone. Build a strong team, get your objectives, and then seek help. There is help out there. The Community Investment Fund Handbook, we're really excited to get that out. Not only is there the handbook, but we have a number of resources that will be available, downloadable spreadsheets and templates that you can use. So that's one source. Finding a legal or financial advisor to help you. And there's a growing number of funds out there, and they were all so great in sharing their stories with us for the handbook. And I'm sure they would be happy to share information with you as you develop your fund. So that's all for me, and I'm going to turn it over to Brian to take you on a legal.
All right. Thank you very much, Janice, and thank you also to Michael and Janelle and everyone who's on the webinar. It's really an honor to be here. So I'm going to share my screen now, and let's see if that works. Share. Okay, and I'm going to start. Let's see. Give me a second here. Slideshow. Let me begin. All right. So, so what I'm going to cover is the legal strategies that you can use to build a community investment fund. And I'm going to dig right into it because we don't have much time. So at the top level, you want to keep in mind that there's, from a securities law standpoint, there are sort of two layers of regulation that you need to be aware of. One is the regulation of the offering, and when I say offering, I mean when you're taking an investment under the securities laws, you're doing an offering. You're offering something to your investors. What that thing is that you're giving to your investors depends on what how you want to design your fund. It's typically debt or equity, but you're offering something to them when they invest in your fund. That process is covered by, at the federal level, the Securities Act of 1933, and at the state level, there are somewhat parallel laws in every state that are often referred to as blue sky laws or just as state securities laws. I'm not going to focus too much on that piece, although we do have one slide on that. I'm mostly going to talk about the second layer of securities regulation that applies to funds, and that is the regulation of the fund structure. And that's the Investment Company Act of 1940. So I'll get to that in a moment. But first, just really quickly, here are the ways that you can raise capital. These are strategies for a securities offering that you can use to raise capital into a fund. Now, as it happens, these are exactly the same strategies that are available to any organization, any company that wants to raise capital. So these are not specific to funds. The next layer I'm going to talk about is specific to funds, but these are the ways that any entity can raise capital into their organization. So there's the charitable strategy. And by the way, let me back up for a moment. When we talk about strategies, what we really mean is ways of navigating through the securities laws that allow you to do it efficiently without too much burdensome regulation. Because if you don't fit within one of these exemption strategies, you have to carry a very heavy and expensive compliance burden. It's not that you can't use a strategy other than what I talked about here. It's just that it might be too expensive. And basically, if you aren't going to rely on an exemption from the securities laws, what that means is you're going to do a full-blown IPO, and that's going to cost, from a couple $100,000 up to a few million. So the idea here is how do you avoid that kind of expense? And these are the strategies that allow you to avoid that expense. If you're a charity, there's a strategy for you at the federal level and in most states. There's regulation crowdfunding that allows you to raise up to $1.07 million in a nationwide offering on a portal. As you can see, I'm just going to walk through these quickly because this isn't where I'm going to focus today. But moving on, there's in many states there is intrastate crowdfunding available through a state level exemption. And then there are, we move into the world of direct public offerings, which are typically registered at the state level. Intrastate is within one state, and there's no cap on how much you can raise in an intrastate direct public offering. It is often the simplest and least expensive way to do a community capital offering. And if you want to do a multi-state, you can cross state lines and raise capital in 2 or 3 or 4 states with a $5 million per year cap. And by the way, when I talk about a cap, whether it's $1 million under Reg CF, $5 million here, or some of the others, I'm talking about an annual cap. So this is over a 12-month period. And then if you want to raise capital, a lot of money in a lot of states, then it brings you up into the realm of Regulation A. Tier 1, there's 2 tiers, Tier 1, Tier 2. Tier 1 is not that useful, I'll skip that one. Tier 2 is the one that can be really useful. It's got a $50 million cap. It's nationwide. It does not require state level registration because it kind of preempts state law. Now, just a quick word about these. Most of these have been around for a very long time. People often talk about how crowdfunding is new, and for the first, a couple of years ago, you saw a lot of headlines that says now, for the first time in history, you're able to raise money from non-accredited investors. That's actually not true because direct public offerings, intrastate, multi-state, these have been around for as long as securities laws have existed. So these have never not been legal in all of U.S. history at least. Now, some of these strategies are relatively recent, like Reg CF, which went into effect about 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years ago. Reg A has been around for a very long time also, but it was reconfigured a couple of years ago to make it more useful. So anyway, I just want to give you a sense of what the options are. But let's move on to the meat of what we're talking about today. And that's the structure of investment funds, like community investment funds. Now, as with the offering side, the idea here is first of all, this is regulated by the 1940 Investment Company Act. It places a very heavy compliance burden on funds unless they are exempt. Now, by heavy compliance burdens, I mean this is what full-blown multi-billion-dollar mutual funds have to do. It's all the regulations that apply to a mutual fund. You don't want to be covered by that. It costs, again, in the hundreds of thousands in compliance. You don't want to do that unless you really want to, start a $50 or $100 million fund or more. So generally, we're talking about finding an exemption from the 1940 Act so that you can do it on a community scale without losing money. Now, there are, and in the book, the handbook that Michael talked about, we outline about 15 strategies that allow you to proceed without that heavy compliance burden under the 1940 Act. I'm not going to go through all of them. I want to pick out about 6 of them. 3 of them are strategies that have some charitable element, and 3 of them have a strategy that they are exempt from the 1940 Act or simply not covered by the 1940 Act because they are considered to not be primarily in the securities investing business. Now this is a good place to back up for a moment and say, when I talk about a fund, that may be obviously what that means, but what it really means, it's an aggregator it's an entity that raises capital from multiple people and then invests in multiple projects. So if you are simply an operating company, a brewery, a dry cleaning shop, or whatever it may be, you are not a fund. But if your business is to raise capital and then to invest in a brewery and invest in a dry cleaner or what have you, now we're talking about a fund. And so the idea of this last group here that I'll talk about is, even if you're set up that way, there may be some quirks in the 1940 Act that allow you to do that without being covered by the 1940 Act because you're not primarily in the securities investing business. And I'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. First, let's talk about the most common true community investment fund strategy of all, and that is the charitable loan fund. There's probably 100 of these around the country. I've given some examples here on the right side. RSF, Social Finance, is quite well known. PV Grows, Michael already talked about. Calvert Foundation is another one. There's a number of others. And I think we've already talked about a couple of other charitable loan funds on the call, and several of them are highlighted in the handbook that you can download. But the key features are, first, it has to be a charity that is doing this, and by necessarily that means incoming investment must be debt, because nobody can have an equity interest or own a charity. So we're talking about a charitable organization that raises debt capital and then turns around and makes typically loans. Now I won't go into detail. Strictly speaking, that fund can make equity investments and other kinds of investments, but for practical reasons, those are typically outgoing loans that it makes. Let's see, I won't probably go into too much more detail about that. As with any of them, I'm going to have to go through this quickly. Let me just do a time check here. We've got, better get moving. Okay, let me move on. Okay, pooled income fund. I won't go into too much more detail. Jen has already talked about it. But again, there's a charitable element. And the idea is you put your money into a trust that is established by a charity. The donor or anyone that the donor designates as the life beneficiary gets the income beneficiary gets the income for the remainder of their life. So it is truly a life income stream. You can identify anybody that is in existence as your beneficiary. It can be yourself and your spouse, your child, your grandchild, your great-grandchild, as long as they are in existence at the time you make this contribution. When the last life beneficiary dies, and there can be more than one of them, when the last of them dies, then that portion of the trust assets that was originally contributed is taken out of the trust and goes to the charity. That's the charitable element that takes this whole thing out of the 1940 Act. It makes it exempt as a claimable thing. And this is commonly used by big institutions like universities and hospitals and so on, although it's rarely been used for true local investing or community development. So we're really not suggesting something new, but a new way of using an old tool that we think can be very, very useful for communities. A charitable equity fund, I won't go into too much more detail because this is not really open for community investment except indirectly. This is simply a fund that aggregates investment from other charities, but the beauty of that is if all the money that comes into this fund is charitable in its origin, it can invest in anything it wants to, and it can share profits with its charitable investors. And notably, that one of those charitable investors could be a pooled income fund. So there's kind of there's a possibility there of combining a couple strategies here in a way that can be very useful. All right, now on to the strategies that don't involve an entity where the fund is not primarily in the securities investing business. Now, if you have a business that really is in some other line of business and has a supplemental fund, which is to say that also invests in, say, its clients as a side business, but not its primary business, then you effectively have a fund that isn't covered by the 1940 Act. And that can work really well if you have the kind of fund where you want to invest in your client. Let's say you're a co-working space, maker space. I listed some things here: an incubator or accelerator. But even a food cooperative. Imagine a food co-op also wants to invest in local producers of the groceries and whatever that it sells. You can have a supplemental fund for that kind of a business. Okay, I know I'm running out of time, so let me go quickly through the rest of these. A holding company. Now, Michael talked about one that's a holding company. It was the Evergreen, I can't remember the exact name, but that one, yes, that one is a holding company. And the idea there is that if you have a fund that invests in majority or controlling interest in its portfolio companies, then it's essentially deemed to be in the business of its portfolio companies and not in the securities business. This is basically the strategy used by Berkshire Hathaway. You'll notice that Berkshire Hathaway is not regulated as a mutual fund, and this is why. Because they invest in controlling or majority interest. And so as with that evergreen fund, the one potential use is to have a community fund that is specifically intended to acquire businesses of retiring, say, baby boomer business owners who don't have family who want to take over the business, and where there's otherwise a risk of losing that business if you can't find a buyer. This fund could acquire those businesses and maintain them for the community and avoid that loss to the community. And then finally, a real estate fund. This may be perhaps in some, possibly the most valuable type of community investment fund there is, because real estate is at the very heart of any community. And it turns out that if you're primarily investing in real estate, that itself is an exemption from the 1940 Act. So you can have a true real estate fund where the community itself is investing in its own real estate. So everybody in the community can be a real estate owner indirectly. And that can be very powerful, very empowering for those residents. Now, one other variant on this I'll mention here, and then I think this is my last substantive slide. You can combine some of these things with tax benefits, and I've got a slide here. I won't dwell on it, but you can set up a real estate fund that is open for community investment that also qualifies as an opportunity fund and may have some tax advantages to those investors. Now there are some issues that are sort of up in the air about the extent to which tax benefits can be offered to non-wealthy investors, but that's a conversation for another day. I think I will, just quickly, a couple of others I won't dwell on, but just to mention, private fund is actually the most common fund strategy there is. I don't really talk about it because that's not very democratic. It's not really open for community investment, but often one of the funds that ends up being a true community investment fund started out as a private fund. So it's worth keeping that strategy in mind. A couple other here that I don't think we have time for. So what I want to leave you with is just the idea that there are a number of strategies that allow you to do this. So yes, it's okay to think outside the box and to think about ways of doing things that go beyond the conventional wisdom. So with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing, and I think I turn it back over to Michael, who's taking it from here.
Okay. So there were not a lot of questions that were posted, but feel free to post them now, or if you want to, unmute yourself and share a question, we could do it that way as well. We are happy to go to the half hour if there is the interest.
Mike, I see something about an investment club, and I didn't mention that, but it is described in the handbook. And since there's a question about it, let me delve into that just momentarily. An investment club is kind of a quirky thing because it has to remain private, and so investment clubs should not be raising capital via any kind of a web presence. The idea of an investment club is it doesn't issue securities, and that's what takes it out of the 1940 Investment Company Act. And the reason it doesn't issue securities is because of and I won't go into too much detail because this is a little bit longer explanation, but if you get the definition of what constitutes a security, it has to do with earning profits from the efforts of others. Now, if you're investing your own money and making your own investment decisions, you're not relying on the efforts of others, you're relying on your own effort. And so the idea is you pool 3 or 4 or 5 people together and you collaborate and you invest together, and every one of those individuals is fully engaged in the process of making decisions about investing, then that group of people together, they are not they are not issuing themselves securities. Because they are not expecting profits from the efforts of others in the group. They can come together and form an LLC, and it doesn't constitute an investment fund for purposes of that 1940 Act, as long as every one of them is fully engaged in business decisions about what the fund will invest in. And also, as long as they are not conducting any kind of a public offering of the investment opportunity. As soon as they conduct a public offering, that probably transforms it into a securities offering, and that takes them out of that eliminates that exclusion from the 1940 Act, and that could mean that the whole thing is in violation. So I worry a little bit about investment clubs, particularly those that have any kind of a web presence, because they may not actually constitute, they may not qualify as investment clubs. But anyway, that's the idea. You can certainly do that in small private groups of your friends, colleagues, and whatever. But again, it has to be private.
So, Brian, if you have a moment, look in the chat, and there's a couple of new questions. There's one that I'll answer in the meantime while you're absorbing that, which is, are there any limitations on people's ability to put money and, use solo 401k money or self-directed IRA money for these kinds of investments? And there may be, while there may be something we haven't thought of, if you as an individual are allowed to put into, chances are very good, like 99%, that you could use your self-directed IRA or solo 401k to do so. I mean, the only thing I can think of that might be a limitation is that you are prohibited with these do-it-yourself accounts from self-dealing and putting money into businesses in which you have controlling interests. So if this happened to be a fund that was all about your own businesses, you might be in some hot water. It depends on the details. But generally speaking, if this is open for your investment as an individual, you can use your do-it-yourself accounts for it.
I could add a couple things to that if you're interested. One is that if you have your retirement savings with a self-directed IRA custodian that's not in your state, sometimes that custodian is reluctant to invest in things in your state. They say, oh, you need to do securities compliance for whatever state the custodian is in. So choosing a custodian in your state could help overcome that. And then there's also with retirement savings, as compared to conventional savings, you need to invest as a prudent investor would, which is a topic of a webinar we have upcoming.
Michael, I'll jump in. There are a number of questions regarding including unaccredited investors and investor education. So I thought I would jump in a little bit on that. One of the benefits of using a community or including unaccredited investors in a community investment fund from the investor standpoint is that their responsibility for due diligence is really on the fund itself, and it relieves some of the due diligence burden from unaccredited investors of having to do the due diligence on every company that's invested in within the portfolio. What the investors really need to be educated on is the fund itself. So how is the fund structured? How is their investment treated? Is it a note? Is it an equity investment into the fund? And then what is their expectation for their return on investment back out of the fund itself? And then if there is any participation, there is some funds are looking to include investor participation in some decision making around the portfolio. Then you'd need to go a little bit deeper into investor education. But really, one of the beauties of community investment funds is that it should be somewhat easier for people to understand, because it starts to resemble more of a mutual fund type investment, because they're investing into a portfolio of companies rather than having to make direct investments into each of these individual companies.
All right. Well, let me jump in and answer a couple of these questions, which I think are sort of about the regulatory aspect of these things. Okay, government-owned funds. So the theory there is, and the exemption in the 1940 Act is simply that a fund that is owned by a government or that is a government agency will be exempt from the 1940 Act. And so the idea there is, how can you use that for a true community investment fund that allows for broad investment? And the answer is, you could have a fund that is owned by a government agency or by a joint powers authority or something, and it raises debt capital, and in that respect, it would be similar to a charitable loan fund. It would be raising debt capital. Those investors would not be owners, because again, it has to be government owned, but they can be invest in debt, and there could probably be a kind of revenue share component of that without it crossing over the line into ownership. This, after all, does not need to be a charitable fund, so it's not subject to the same rules as a charitable fund, even though it might do similar kinds of activities. But you could raise capital broadly in a debt offering, and you can invest in any sorts of local businesses in that fund. So, we have never seen one done quite that way, but it's certainly possible under the 1940 Act. Let's see.
Brian, there's
okay,
a question here about,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's a question here about limitations on the number of unaccredited investors into a fund, and I know that you have, there are some, so why don't you speak to that?
Yeah, so if you are, okay, so the answer is it depends. If you have a charitable loan fund, there is no limit on how many investors you can have. You can have thousands of investors, that's no problem. If you have any kind of an equity fund, in other words, in any fund where your investors are acquiring equity shares, now there are a couple sources of potential limits there. If it's a private fund, then it can't have more than 99 shareholders. You want to keep it under 100 investors. But we're not really talking much about private funds here, since we're focusing on true community investment funds. But now let's say you're working with a true community investment fund that is open to public investment, and let's say it's a real estate fund, for example. There is pragmatically a limitation on how many investors you can have in that fund, but because of a different law. It has nothing to do with the 1940 Act. It has to do with the 1934 Securities Exchange Act, which basically says that if you have, and now there's a couple prongs to this, but if you trigger if you meet these trigger these elements, then you become a reporting company, which means, and it's not that it can't be done, it's just that it dramatically increases your. You don't want to become an SEC reporting company. That would basically mean you're, filing 10Ks and 10Qs and a whole range of other reports, just like any publicly traded company. But those triggers are this: either it's 10 million in assets, and either 500 or more non-accredited equity investors, or 2,000 total equity investors. Now, each of those bits is important, because you can have any number of debt investors. Those don't count toward the 500 or the 2,000, but you can't have any more than 500 non-accredited equity investors, and without triggering that SEC reporting company. So that's the pragmatic limitation on how many investors you can have. Assuming this is a true public offering, you don't want to, again, 500 non-accredited investors is your cap for equity investors. Yeah, okay. Let's
I'll,
see.
I'll jump in here now. There's a question around, is anyone aware of examples of a foundation creating a community investment fund as a complement to its philanthropic efforts? I'm working now with kind of a variation on that theme. It's not a foundation, but there is a nonprofit that whose philanthropic efforts are more just around community support and you know, direct community involvement, that is working to set up a community investment fund to complement its activities. So it's kind of a variation on that theme, and I'm working on that with some of Brian's colleagues from Cutting Edge Capital. I actually think it's a great opportunity for foundations to not just buttress their philanthropic work by helping to support community investment, but one of the best things about community investment funds that include grassroots unaccredited investors is that it can work towards building more equitable distribution of wealth. So I think it's I'm sorry. I think it's a great idea, and more foundations should be thinking about it. So let's find some and make it happen.
I saw another question around liquidity, and the question was how do you how can you make your involvement in these funds liquid? And it really depends on the terms that the fund is offering on the securities. So, as the examples I went over showed, most of these community funds really are giving you options of anything from 2 years to 7 years, and rewarding you with somewhat higher payouts, usually as a dividend or as an interest payment, if you will stay in longer. And then what you also want to be aware of is that your interest, your security is going to tell you whether or not you have the ability to transfer it, and how to transfer it, and to whom you might be able to transfer it. Chances are very good that that's going to be somewhat limited, but that is a question to ask before you acquire a security in a fund.
Brian, there's a question here too about nonprofit funds. The restriction on using equity, is it from the IRS rules on private inurement or from the SEC definition of investment company?
It's more the latter, because what the SEC's exclusion says is that you're exempt from the 1940 Act if you are organized solely for charitable purposes and none of your profits can go to any private investor. But as it turns out, that's also the same as the rules, the IRS rules for what constitutes a charity. So it's not a private endowment exactly. It's just simply definition. And oddly, you don't necessarily have to have a 501c3 tax-exempt letter from the IRS in order to qualify for the charitable exemption under the 1940 Act. The 1940 Act does not ever refer to being acknowledged by the IRS to be charitable. It simply says you have to qualify as a charitable organization. So the idea there is, you can't, you clearly can't own a charity. A charity can't issue equity. It's just not, it's not possible. But the question we sometimes get is, what if you're kind of in a gray area that, where you, for example, have a fund that wants to, issue revenue share securities. And I would say you want to avoid revenue share if you have a charitable organization, charitable fund, or any kind of a charity, unless it's very carefully crafted so that it doesn't resemble a share of profits. But the problem with revenue sharing is that it sometimes is the functional equivalent of sharing profits, which is forbidden for a charity. But that's that's a whole conversation. That's we could continue that offline if anyone wants to talk about that.
So Brian, there's another question here which is good for you, and it's about intrastate funds. If a fund is solely an intrastate fund, does it have to worry about the 40 Act? The answer is yes, because.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yes. So there is a kind of intrastate exemption. Now when we're talking about the 1933 securities, actually the intrastate exemption is really simple. As long as the company is organized in a state and meets certain criteria, it's exempt from the law, and there's not even a filing. I should say it's exempt from the law. It's exempt from registration under the law. There's no filing you need to make with the SEC at all if you are doing an offering under the intrastate exemption under the 1933 Act. Now, that's the law that governs offerings. So, it would be nice if the 1940 Act had an intrastate exemption that kind of mirrored that functionally, but we do not. We do not have such a nice, convenient exemption that mirrors the other exemptions for intrastate companies. What we have is an exemption that says you're exempt in certain criteria. One, you can't raise more than 10 million total, not this one per year, but total. Two, it has to be a closed-end fund. In other words, investors can't come in and out over a period of, a multi-year period. There's one offering, investors come in and they're basically in for the duration of the fund until you liquidate it down the road, 7 or 10 years down the road or something. So it has to be closed-end. It has to be, and then, the intrastate, all the investors have to be resident of the same state. That's not difficult. But now here's the clincher. Even if you can comply with those requirements and do this all cost effectively with a total size of 10 million, it's not a self-executing exemption. And what I mean by that is you still have to go to the SEC and say, here's what we want to do. May we do this? And they have the ability to, the SEC, have the ability to impose any of the 1940 Act's rules that they want to on the fund. And historically, when these were done decades ago, the SEC did in fact impose a broad range of rules that make it pragmatically impossible to operate a fund effectively with a size of less than $10 million. Has never been used since 1976 was the last time there's any reference to anyone even trying to use it on the SEC's documents database. We don't think it's been used since then because it's just not cost effective. Now, it does raise a question which is maybe beyond the scope of today's discussion of could we get the SEC to modify that exemption or maybe create a new exemption for intrastate funds that actually is self-executing and otherwise cost-effective? We may hope, but we don't have that from the SEC yet. So stay tuned.
So there's another question about public banking, which I'll take a whack at, because public banking means many things now to many people. But I think the best way of thinking about the relationship of public banking to what we talked about today is that it could be another investment option that will pool your capital over some geographic area. Now, a lot of the public bank ideas are being talked about at state levels in very big states like California. So, the probability of your dollar going into a state bank and actually touching directly your community is going to be attenuated by that size. But in a smaller state, it may have a closer relationship. And certainly there are some cities that are thinking about creating public banking or quasi-public banking kinds of institutions. And one of the exemptions, actually, that hasn't been used, the exemptions in the Investment Company Act, is for a local government to create its own investment fund. And then it could take in other money. So that is perhaps related to some of the models of public banking or different. It depends how you took it.
I'd like to, I'm just going to chime in real quickly again on investor education. I just want to let folks know that there's a resource, there's a website called, actually I'm going to put it in the chat here, local-investing.com. It's a website that's been around since 2012, I think, and it's in need of a makeover, which it is getting. So my nonprofit just got a grant, and we have taken over the website. We're going to be completely overhauling it, but just taking all of the great information that's already there and making it easier to find. But if you want to access it now, it's still live, and you can find all sorts of great information for anyone who's interested in investing locally. So just wanted to let people know about that.
So Brian, there's one final question here from Janelle. I'm going to read it out loud. If there's time, I'd love it if you could explain how the Runway project raised capital using CDs at Self-Help Credit Union. Is that a creative workaround for securities law purposes?
Well, yes, it is in a sense. So as I understand it, and I've looked at it, but I haven't. There may be some nuances of which I'm not aware. They're not a client of mine, but as I understand it, the way they do that is the Runway project has, as the question suggests, has partnered with the credit union, and the idea is investors don't come in directly to the Runway project. Investors are coming in and acquiring, buying a CD at the credit union, and then pledging that CD to support loans made by the credit union to these various projects that the Project Runway wants to support. I believe that's the way it works. If someone has better information, if that's not quite the way it works, I maybe speak up. But that's my understanding. And I suppose it could also work if the credit union took that money and made a loan to Project Runway, and then they turned around and made outgoing loans to various projects. But I think it's the credit union that makes the loans directly, because that would eliminate the necessity for Runway Project to have their own lender's license. So I guess the big picture question is that a strategy that can be used to get to the end result efficiently? And I think yes, because credit unions and banks and so on are themselves exempt from the 1940 Act. So they can do these things without having to worry about the 1940 Act. And since we're talking about how do you do this without worrying about the 1940 Act, I think this falls squarely in that category. It's a little different in that it's not really a fund. That is, I don't think again, as I understand it, it's not a financial sense. And then invest in other projects. But if you get to the same result through this partnership with the Self-Help Credit Union, or it could be any other credit union or any other bank, I think that's a really viable strategy that can help get there.
Thank you for that.
So I want to wrap this all up and thank my colleagues Janice and Brian for a great presentation. Thanks to NextEgg for the opportunity to share this with you. And really we did not write this handbook for your intellectual curiosity. We wrote it so that you would actually do it. And so we're hoping that many of you take these ideas and run with them, share with us in any form, whether it's the NextEgg or NC3 or your own statewide network. Share with us what's working, what isn't, and hopefully we can use this to develop a great new tool for social change. So again, thanks to all of you, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you so much, all.